parenthood. So
sure is.
yeah, good. Okay, so last week we kind of concluded with a conversation about a movie that I was encouraging you to watch at least the opening scenes of, and just to kind of catch up again on that, the movie Les Miserables. Did anyone watch the whole of the movie? And if not, what did you get from the opening scene?
Okay. I didn't watch the whole movie, but I've seen it a couple of years ago.
Okay.
But I guess looking at it in a different perspective now than I did back then, I do notice a lot more biblical terms. And like you said, look out for the crosses. And it was, the crosses came at like the right time, showing like, I guess he was like being reborn, I guess, once he got out of prison, and he was like a born again Christian, you know. And then again, when he stole the silver and the priest gave him more, it was as if Jesus, you know, Jesus' law always give them more, you know. So I did notice a lot more of that. And I do have a newfound respect for the general, Javert or whatever. So now I see him in a different light as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's easy, you know, and maybe at first glance or the first watch, you think, well, he is somehow the anti-hero in the play or the movie. But again, if you look at it from that perspective, you see there's, well, you know, that's, yeah, it's an interesting piece, interesting take. Yeah, how did you like that? In fact, all of you, if you had a chance to see the intro, you saw that scene where he is dragged back to the priest, having stolen, and then the big surprise when the priest then gives him the two candlesticks, the silver candlesticks. And if you get a chance to watch the whole way through, watch, because you'll see those candlesticks come up a couple more times later in the movie, that whereas the other stuff may have been sold off, Valjean keeps those candlesticks, and they become kind of symbolic of from where he came. Again, not symbols of his failure, but symbols of the grace that met him in his failure, which then transforms him. So yeah, good take, Aaron. Because I think that's kind of, as the story plays, that's exactly what Victor Hugo wanted you to see, that this man's life was remade, reborn out of an act of grace that he didn't deserve, but that was given to him anyway. And which again, I think raises the question in Hugo's mind. Again, Hugo not necessarily writing from a Christian perspective, but part of the Enlightenment and influenced by that, and wrestling with that question: how do we change behavior? Which is a good question to ask for teachers. Yeah, how do we change behavior? Is it by enforcing rules and living by the letter of the law, or is it by demonstrating unmerited grace, or is there a balance somewhere between the two? Because that becomes a question, I think, in society. But certainly it's the age-old biblical question as well. And like you said, Aaron, isn't that the whole message of the gospel message of Jesus, that not what we deserve, but even more, a favor, a grace that is given to us. So yeah, interesting. Anybody else? And I'll be honest with you, I like nearly cry through that whole movie. So it usually doesn't start until the priest gives him the candlesticks. Then the waterworks begin, and then I'll cry throughout the rest of the movie too, from point to point. Even to the point now, sometimes I'll just hear a song in the context of the movie. I know what's coming, and I start crying ahead of time. I'm a basket case. So But it's but again, a interesting contrast. And there's a lot of other things that go on, as you say, Aaron. There's a lot of other things, other pieces of the story that maybe is what you noticed the first time, whereas this time you're seeing a little more of the other aspects of the story. Good. Anybody else? Were you surprised by the priest's reaction?
I have some random thoughts.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so my random thoughts are, I think maybe Hugo was thinking some of the audience is going to understand Javert's perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Javert's perspective, thinking that we're kind of more like him, that, you know, the rules are important, but, you know, but I guess grace isn't in there. And then I want to go off of what you said, where you said, is it, you know, is it grace or is it some kind of balance? And I don't know whether it's grace or balance, but I think the idea is, as a teacher and maybe as a parent, that we want to, you know, do grace by showing love, but we also want to set an example by our own actions.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's and as a, well, or Jason, as a teacher, you know, I think, or as a parent as well, you're right, there's that setting the right example. But even in a classroom, I mean, every classroom has, you have classroom rules, don't you? And the expectation is that students will follow those rules, and there's going to probably be consequences for not following those rules. But in every classroom, there's also got to be a, you know, some sort of mechanism for when kids don't follow the rules. You know, how do you begin to restore, you know, that proper place in the community again, or the proper place in the classroom again? How do you begin to do that? So, you know, it's an interesting conundrum that's not just, you know, for Bible class. It's and not just for movies. It's something that really does apply, I think, to us as human beings, as parents, and certainly as teachers. So yeah, good. Anyone else? We'll go one more, then I'll move off of Les Mis because I don't want to spend too much time. That was last week's lesson, but I think it's because that gives us pause even when we kind of wrap up that section last week on law, that to look at the Bible and say, well, it is just merely it's a bunch of laws to be followed, is giving the Bible not what it's due, but to try to do, you know, get the message of what the Bible is, and try to do it without law or without, you know, the kind of boundaries or order that is there. And a lot of people try that too. You know, they say, oh, it's just about love, 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 Jesus, 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 you know, grace, grace, grace. And that's true. But to try to do it without the context of the boundaries kind of misses something as well. Just like a classroom that's all about extending grace, but has no boundaries or no classroom discipline ever. You know, you're not going to find, that's not going to be a good, healthy environment either. So there's a middle ground somewhere in there, and how the two intertwine. And again, for Hugo, he made one character all grace, and that's Valjean. He received grace, he was a giver of grace. And he made one character all law, that's Javert. You know, he was all about the law, and he lived by the law. And when the law didn't seem to work for him, I don't want to spoil it for you. Yeah, so very dramatic, right near the end of the movie. Very dramatic when Javert wrestles with this. You can't be changed, you know, because in a world where it only matters what the law is and how you've broken the law, then there's no room for change. And so he says, yeah, it's very, very dramatic. So if you were rooting for Hugh Jackman, you will be glad as he remains victorious. If you were rooting against Russell Crowe, yeah, it doesn't end so well for him. So anyway, spoiler alert, but it's good stuff. Good question. So again, but it's appropriate. I think it moves us, you know, when we talk about classroom stuff and how does the Bible even fit. Again, it's not so much how do I bring the Bible into the classroom here, but how do I see even the law and grace that the Bible speaks about, and how it works together, and how we then apply that very same principle when we move into other aspects of our life, including our work in the classroom. So, okay. Wanted to also move us into this week. And again, I mentioned that this week we're talking about biblical narrative. And I believe I said 40% of the Old Testament is biblical narrative. And depending on how you read it, nearly half of the New Testament is in narrative form. Storytelling, it's a big piece of the Bible account. If you read in your Fee and Stewart book in chapter 5, it makes mention of that. And I know that's part of you may not have read it yet this week, but I'll just, draw your attention to it. Where is it at here in chapter 5? Yeah, here it is. Chapter 5 begins on page 93. And it talks about this literary art form called narrative. And but again, storytelling or hearing stories, whether you hear it, in your ears or you're sitting at a movie and watching it demonstrated for you, this is how we as humans communicate. Whether it be Les Mis or any other movie, you go and you receive something from that movie because they're telling you a story. They're inviting you into the midst of the story, and it's out of the story that you receive some sort of message from it. So in Fee and Stewart on page 95, which is like the third page of that chapter, it references the idea that whenever we're reading through biblical narrative, we need to keep the three levels of narrative in mind. There is the larger, what we call the meta-narrative. How does this particular story communicate the larger story of the biblical narrative? So when we find a story, say in the book of Genesis or in 2 Samuel or wherever we may find it, the Gospel of Matthew, how does this story fit in the larger story of God's redemptive plan that Grimsrud talks so well about? How does it fit in that larger story of it? And especially when we look at Old Testament narrative, like we're looking at this week, we need to also keep in mind that before there was a Bible the way we have it, there was the Old Testament, which was the Jewish Testament, the scripture that Jesus knew. And for them, how does this story fit in the larger context of that original covenant people? Because when it was first included, that's what it was trying to point towards. We now, with the New Testament added too, we can see there's another aspect to it. And then every story also has we look for the message or the meaning of the narrative on its own merits of that particular story. And sometimes that's difficult. And this is where some people, when they start reading the Bible, often bog down because they're looking for, in a particular story, they're looking for what is the message here? And sometimes the message is really hard to get. We find, especially like in some of the stories you read in Genesis, some of those stories are weird. I mean, you're talking about someone marrying a brother, and then his brother dies, so you marry his other brother, and then he dies, and then before you can marry the third brother, you pretend to be a prostitute, and the father of the brothers then impregnates you, and you're saying, what in the world? This is crazy stuff. This can't be in the Bible. It's weird. And the story on its own, in its own context, probably doesn't make any sense. Probably didn't make a whole lot of sense 3,000 years ago. Probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense to us today because you don't really hear a message in it. But when you see how it fits in with the larger story, especially the larger story of how it fits in the story of God's covenant people in the Old Testament, or as part of the larger story leading us towards the redemptive plan of Jesus, it begins to make sense. And so sometimes because we only read it on the level of narrative right there before us, we miss out on the bigger picture, and some of these odd stories sometimes cause us a lot of trouble. And I don't mean to degrade any of the stories that are in the Bible, but some of them are weird, let's face it. And it's just, we have to get through some of those. But again, it's because we have to look at it and see them on the different levels of bringing the biblical story forward. The other thing about narrative that is key, and this is an obvious thing, is that narrative is always going to be, we need to take into consideration the narrator's point of view, because whenever you're reading a narrative, it's not just reading straight facts. This happened, this happened, this happened. There's always going to be a pointer perspective that if we understand where the narrator's coming from, we might find clues in his narration. That'll help us understand the point of what he's trying to make. And we'll do an example of that here in a little bit. But that's going to lead us then, and again, how then the narrator, begins to weave the story, how he unveils his plot, how he begins to develop characters, and which characters he really invests in and which ones he doesn't, can also give us clues or hints as to the message that he wants us to take away. So, and then the final piece for tonight is looking at what it means, how we fit that together with greatness or integrity or leadership as it comes. How do we see that being played out for us in the Bible account? Because that's kind of our theme for the week. Okay, so the idea of greatness, one of the assignments this week, just make sure I know where I'm at. One of the assignments this week, and you may have seen it already, I posted it up earlier, and there is an assignment called The One Great Person. It's 3.1. And in fact, I'll show you the worksheet here. I think I'll show you the worksheet here. Okay, 3.1. If you click on it, you will download a paper that looks like this. It is pretty simple and it's pretty self-explanatory. You are to talk to 10 people, and they can be anybody you want to choose to talk to. It's more fun when you have a diverse group, whether it be diversity in the way of age groups or genders, or even either religious or ethnic background. It makes it interesting. With only a sample size of 10, you're not going to probably get a wide enough sample size to do too much scientifically, but it's kind of interesting to see how different people will answer this very question. And so the question is simply this: you ask someone to name one great person, and then the follow-up question is, why do you consider them great? If you can, unless you have to, I recommend you not tell them that it's for a Bible class, because as soon as you say it's for a Bible class, then they think there's a right answer, that you should say Jesus or whatever, because we all know how, when you're in Sunday school, you got to get the right answer. But what I'm looking for, and I think what you will find, is that different people, even though we all know what the word great means, different people will associate different attributes to that. And so you'll find as you do your survey that, say, example, person number 1 will give you the name of somebody, maybe somebody who they know, who has been important or significant or influential in their life. And so you will write that down and why they are. Or person number 2 may give you someone that they follow. Either they follow on social media, or maybe it's an athlete or a celebrity that they think has really got a good thing going. And so they will say that individual is great. Or perhaps they'll look back in history and say this was a person who helped shape history or helped shape where we're at. And I think I'm going to go out on a limb, and I'm going to bet that you have, in each of your groups of 10, you'll have a variety of people who get listed, and they'll be in all of those categories. And so you don't have to challenge, you don't have to say why, but no, do ask why. And then you'll get different understandings. Again, the idea is, what is our society, or what do people in our society, what do they consider or deem as a great quality? And so that'll be the assignment. So once you've done once you've done those 10 questions or 10 interviews, 1, 2, 3, 4, yep, down to 10. Then you write a 2 or 3 page response essay where you analyze the answers and use your 10 individuals as your window into what society thinks. So you don't have to say, well, these 10 people they're my friends and they're pretty awesome, but they probably don't represent their society larger. Well, they might. And so just use them as what represents how does society view greatness in the world. And again, if you did involve children, which is good to have some kids or teens in your group, because sometimes they see greatness through different lenses than we as adults do. And so, yeah, so make that part of your essay too, especially if you're able to get some kids as part of your interview group. If getting together with people is tricky, or if this just works for you, some people have used, and especially during the pandemic, use social media as a way of getting these answers. The challenge with social media is oftentimes you don't get the variety of age groups that maybe you could otherwise if you were intentional about going out and talking to people. So does that make sense in the way of what the assignment is about? Okay, and you're probably saying, what in the world does this have to do with the Bible? Or what does it have to do with us in this class? And that's a good question. It's a fair question. But I'm going to suggest, I think you'll see it, even as we do some of the conversation tonight, that part of what we're after is what does the world see as great attributes? And then our next question, which we'll talk on a little bit tonight, and you'll see it a little bit in the other lessons throughout the week, that what does the Bible say about greatness as well? And how do those two mesh, or how are those two opposed? So, okay. So to start with, looking at greatness, nowhere in the Bible does it say this is what greatness is. There's a couple places where it refers to greatness, but I'm not going to go to one of those right away. I want to turn in our Bibles to the book of Deuteronomy, which is the 5th book in the Bible, so it's back near the beginning. And in chapter 17 of the book of Deuteronomy, there's an interesting section. In fact, let me get back out of this. Don't need that anymore. There's an interesting section. I would invite you to turn to it. So if you've got your red Bible and you want to turn to page 279, that's where we'll find this section. And in this section, this is in the history of Israel. They are still in the wandering period. They are about to move into the promised land. When they move into the promised land, Moses will have died by then, and they will move in as a group of 12 different, what they call tribes or clans of people. They're all related, but some not. I mean, they're separated after many generations into smaller family groups. But one day they're going to want to have a king who will unite them. And so here in Deuteronomy, this is a couple hundred years before they ask for a king. But in this section here, God speaks through Moses and gives them a job description of what they should look for when they select their king. And again, the king won't be selected for a couple hundred years. So it's interesting that God gives them this job description a long time before they will ever have a need for it. But he does. And so the interesting part is looking at this job description and saying, why does God say that? What about this is going to be a key piece to having the right person as as their king. So if you will join me, we're going to start in verse 14. And we're going to read to the end of the chapter, which is verse 20. So I got about 7 verses there to read. Do I have a volunteer who would read this while we listen and kind of take notes as to the characteristics that God says is the description of the perfect king for Israel?
I can start, but what page are we on?
We're on page 279 in the Red Bible.
Verse 14?
Yeah, verse 14. So it's Deuteronomy chapter 17, beginning at verse 14. So if you're on that page, you see, yeah, it's pretty simple.
Okay.
When you have come, that's where we're beginning.
Okay.
So has everybody got their Bible with them? And if you're don't have your Bible open, then listen very carefully. Cicely, if you go ahead and read it for us. And again, listen for the, what is the job description? What are the characteristics that we're looking for?
Okay. When you have come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, I will set a king over me, like all the nations that are around me. You may indeed set over you a king whom the Lord your God will choose. One of your own community you may set as king over you. You are not permitted to put a foreigner over you, who is not of your own community. Even so, he must not acquire many horses for himself, or return the people to Egypt in order to acquire more horses, since the Lord has said to you, you must never return that way again. And he must not acquire many wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away. Also silver and gold he must not acquire in great quantity for himself. When he has taken the throne of his kingdom, he shall have a copy of this law written for him in the presence of the Levitical priests. It shall remain with him, and he shall read it in all the days of his life, so that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, diligently observing all of the words of this law and these statutes, neither exalting himself above other members of the community, nor turning aside from the commandment, either to the right or to the left, so that he and his descendants may reign long over his kingdom in Israel. Is that where you want me to stop?
Yes, I was just looking for my unmute button. So thank you very much. Well done. Well done. Okay, so thank you, Cicely. Let's walk it through. What are some of the key attributes then that God says this king should have, or maybe better said, what are the things that the king should not do, or both?
It says that he must not acquire many horses for himself, or return the people to Egypt to acquire more horses.
Okay, so yeah, horses must be bad. Okay, that's not the point, right? It's not, let's just not have horses around. But there's something to that. Okay, so the idea, I'm just going to make a note of it, and we'll come back to it. So not many horses, and not to go back in order to acquire more horses. Okay.
So no silver or gold in great quantities for himself. So that just means to me, not to be selfish or greed.
Okay. Yeah, it's good. Good. And I let it go. We'll figure out the horses thing in a minute, but I think the gold and silver one is pretty straightforward, isn't it? So he shouldn't be all about building up his own wealth, his own portfolio. Okay, good. What else?
He also must not acquire many wives for himself.
Right. And on that one, it even gives us a little rationale, but it's not a rationale that we're used to, because we live in a society that values monogamy, and so this idea of even having many wives seems a little foreign to us. But in that day, that wasn't uncommon, especially for a person of status or wealth, to have multiple wives. In fact, it was partly how that society functioned. But needless to say, the king is not to have, again, as it says, not too many wives. So I'm not sure how many, in this perspective, how many is too many. I would say more than one is too many. But that's coming from me and has a lot of my cultural bias. In this day, when Moses was alive, they may have had a different number in mind there. Okay, but not too many wives, okay? Anything else that says that the king should do or not do? Be or not be?
Says he shouldn't exalt himself over others.
Okay, right. Which is hard, isn't it? I mean, it's hard if you're the leader to still remain a part of the group, and especially in a political setting like a nation. But okay, so not to be exalted. What would be a positive? How would we say that? If you don't exalt yourself over others, how might we explain that? Or what would be another word?
Basically it'd be like he doesn't think he's better than anybody, that they were all equal in a sense. Like,
okay,
even though he's in power, he's still just like any other human being.
okay. So on a level playing field, he's equal, doesn't think of himself better. I might use the word humble.
I was going to say or grounded.
Or grounded, okay.
Yeah, that's a better word.
Okay. Good. Anything else? Anything else that is deemed as a value for this king? Because again, here it is. This is in narrative form. He doesn't come out and say these are the attributes, but in the narrative form, he says these are things that a king should have. So they're kind of it's like a little bit of a hidden. These are the attributes of any good leader. Be wary of these things. So that he should be grounded, that he should be humble, that he should not have too many horses, too much money, or too many wives. There's a couple more things here that he should either do or not do.
The one about the foreigner, you're not permitted to put a foreigner over you who is not one of your own community. Okay,
so needs to be, the leader of this community needs to be a part of the community. And why would that be? Anyone, you want to take a guess at that one, Aaron?
No.
No? Okay. Anybody else?
Well, I think a member of the community has a vested interest in the success or failure of that community, whereas a foreigner may not.
Right, and a member of the community may understand the cultural do's and don'ts and some of the values that maybe a foreigner would not understand. And so if you're going to have a good leader for your people, you want him to be invested, you're right, in the business, the community, the whatever it is. You want them to have that same interest and not just their own self-interest. Good. In verse 19, there's actually 18 and 19 talks about a couple of other things as well. In 18, it talks about how he should have and keep a copy of this law, and that has been written for that particular king, and it should remain with him. And it's intended for this king to read it every day for all of his life, so that he is, in a sense, steeped in the law and understands the respect of the Lord. So Why would that be important to this new community that is being formed here under Moses' leadership? Why you think the law is such a priority?
Maybe so that he can enforce the laws.
Okay, yeah, he wouldn't know the laws maybe if he doesn't take time to read them. Okay, good. Anybody else?
Not so, just so he can enforce them, but also live by them himself.
Good. Yeah. You know, it's a little bit what we talked about last week about the 10 Commandments, that, you know, there's no punishment necessarily for any of the 10 Commandments, is there? And so the blessing is to actually follow them. It's not so much that there's do this or else you'll pay for it. But it is, you know, the most of the commands that God gives were given in a sense of, if you do this, you and the community will be better for it. And so, yeah, the king is intended to not only be able to enforce the law, but the king is intended to live by that. And as the king with his leadership lives by it, that leadership then should guide the people to also live in a more orderly fashion, and maybe by these new rules that were really new. This first generation that got the 10 Commandments and all the other commandments that went along with it, these were new things, and they were going to separate them from others around them. Their neighbors wouldn't be living by these same rules or laws, and so they would become kind of distinct. And it's that distinctiveness that I think that they're hoping the king will also live by that same distinctiveness and not be like all the other kings around them. Okay, that goes back to the horses, wealth, and wives. In their day, all the kings in that part of the world had many horses, much gold, and many wives. The horses thing is kind of a symbol, and it's something that often we miss because we're not thinking in Old Testament symbolism. But horses referenced military strength. An army that had many horses was at a huge advantage over an army that had no horses. And so for the people of that day, it would be like saying, for the leader of your country, he should not have a large standing army. Probably because if he does, then he's going to put his trust in his army. He shouldn't have a lot of silver and gold. Does that mean that we should not have any wealth? No, but we shouldn't put our trust in what the material world can provide us or what our possessions can supply us. And the idea of many wives, and again, we'll see this as we talk a little bit more tonight about King David. And as you read about King Solomon and some of the other kings, some of them notoriously had multiple wives. And again, that was not unusual in that day and age, but it does lead to some trouble. In fact, that's what it says here in Deuteronomy. Because if you do have many wives, the king's heart will turn away. Turn away from what? Well, turn away from his ability to follow the laws and lead the people as becoming a distinct and unique people in the group, in the world around them. So if you were to build a definition of what is a great person, well, we're going to say someone who doesn't rely on military strength, doesn't rely on his own personal wealth, nor does he seek to generate a large amount of wealth, doesn't have many wives, probably from foreign nations, who would then cause his family to fade away in their relationship with God. He would be a king who would have the law written for him, who would rely upon the law, who would read the law every day, and would be someone who is one of us. Again, that gives a place in the community value system and enables him to not lord it over or take advantage of somebody who is part of his own community, but someone who's connected to the community so that community gets valued above and beyond the idea of merely attaining more power or wealth or position. So this game plan or job description that was laid out here, you'll find as we read forward into this week in this chapter, you'll see that each and every king who comes to the throne in Israel does almost none of these, that there is no king that does this very well. A couple of them do it better than others, and some just completely miss the point. Even the great kings, kings like David, Solomon, and others, you'll say these are the good guys, and even they don't do all of this very well. And because of that, that becomes part of their downfall. But it's still there. So again, this begins to give us some ideas as to what is a value, what is something that we would term as a definition of greatness, because this person is going to be great in the nation, he's going to be the king. So what are some of the personality traits or some of the how you live it out that becomes defining moment for greatness? Okay, we're going to stick with our Bible. We're going to move forward here a little bit because I want to talk about one of the kings that's going to come along, and you'll see that he doesn't do this very well, and there's some other things going on for him. We're going to look at 2 Samuel. Yeah, 2 Samuel in our red Bibles. And again, there's a lot of material in the Old Testament that is considered narrative, and this is a great piece of it. I referenced this briefly in the opening video that you saw, because this is a story about David and one of the incidences that takes place during his lifetime. And again, I think this is a great story for us to look at and really look at it through this literary world's lens. We're going to watch how the narrator tells the story. We're going to watch for clues about what the narrator thinks is important, and those clues will help us better understand what the message is of the story. It's going to feature this idea of what does it mean to be a person of character, or greatness, if you want to use that terminology for it. And he's going to, we're going to watch, we're going to read this story. We're going to run into a few new characters, watch and see which ones get developed, watch and see which one is going to be the one who is most, because he uses contrast here as one of his tools of narrative storytelling. And so we're going to see David contrasted with another character in this story. And we'll just let the story work itself out. It's the story that began, as I said in the opening video, that in the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his officers and all of Israel with him. They ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. Again, as the story begins to unfold right from the very beginning, this opening sentence to what's going to happen here, there is this setting the stage which says something's out of place. And that should be a highlight for us to understand that what the narrator is going to tell us now is not going to be a look at what greatness looks like in King David, but it's going to be the opposite. And he's going to tell a story of failure as it becomes instructive for us to understand how it is that we can succeed. So, so it's on page 467 in your red Bibles, and it begins at 2 Samuel chapter 11. And if we can, I'd like to get at least through chapter 12, through chapter 11. And into a little bit of chapter 12. It's going to be a little bit of reading, but it's an interesting story. Again, the way the biblical narrator tells the story, and he's going to help guide us along as we look at it appropriately. So as we do, in fact, let me see, can I pull this up? Yeah, I'm going to pull this up here. So we'll be asking some questions here as it goes along, and we throw them up on the screen, then we'll come back to them later. Share, there it is. Okay, so when we get started, we're going to be looking and say, who's telling the story? That's an important question for us to ask as we approach this particular text. How does the story begin and how does the story end? We may not get all the way to the end of it, so if we don't, I'll walk us through that. But notice how it begins, and we'll see if there is kind of a bookend at the end. Who are the characters? So as we're reading along or someone's reading it and you're listening, kind of keep track. Who are the main characters and how are they interacting? Number 4, what are some of the characters and how are they developed? You're going to find some are developed completely, where you kind of know what they're thinking. You know, they even, part of the narrative will tell you what's going on in their head. And some of the characters, we will know almost nothing of what they're thinking or how they're feeling about the events that are transpiring around them. So again, our clues are, we need to focus the attention where the narrator focuses the attention. So it's our focus should be on the characters that are being developed. Ask yourself as we're reading along, what characters do you find sympathetic? Which ones am I being drawn to? How is the narrator telling the story that makes this person or this individual someone that I'm rooting for? Because that's not by accident, it's intentional that the person is being lifted that way, because again, there's a point in that. So these are all just kind of ways that we address a narrative when we're looking at it from a biblical narrative, understanding how the narrator, the storyteller, is trying to tell a story and what aspects become important. There's going to be a character in the story. Her name is Bathsheba, but notice that almost every time she is mentioned, she also has other names attached to her name. And why would that be? Why would the narrator want to keep going back to other names for this woman? And what does that say about her role in the story? Who does most of the action? Okay, that's a pretty easy one. And again, one of the key pieces for narrative is to understand when the narrator goes slow and seems almost bogged down or maybe is being repetitive, it's not because he is not clever enough to tell a good story. He is being slow and maybe even repetitive on purpose, because in that slowness and in that repetitiveness, he is trying to make a point even through that. So, so those are just some of the things to be looking for as we go ahead and begin. So on page 467, beginning at or chapter 11, verse 1, I'll need some readers. So Cicely did a great job before. It means you have a pass this time if you would want it. Actually, that's probably better because this one's got at least some funny names in it and places, but it's not too bad. But who would like to be our first reader and take us again from verse 1, say, let's go to verse 5. This will be easy.
I can read.
Okay, please go ahead, Jess.
Okay, so let's see. It's in the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab with his officers and all Israel with him. They ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem. It happened late one afternoon when David rose from his couch and was walking about on the roof of the king's house, that he saw from the roof a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. David sent someone to inquire about the woman. It was reported, "This is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite." So David sent messengers to get her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she was purifying herself after her period. Then she returned to her house. The woman conceived, and she sent and told David, I am pregnant.
Good. Okay, thank you, Jessica. No, I shouldn't say good. That sounds like I'm making a moral statement about the story. No, I was making a statement about the fine job of reading you just did. Clearly, this is not a good thing. I mean, we all celebrate pregnancy, but this is not a wanted pregnancy. This is a very problematic pregnancy, and so we'll go on. Interesting, some of the odd little side notes that the narrator drops in. Almost, it's like, really, do I need to know that? But again, it's part of this larger story. So let's just keep all that kind of in place for now. Okay, so there's a problem. There's an unwanted pregnancy. There's it's an issue because David and Bathsheba are not married. That David is to be this king who does nothing but read the Torah every day, and lives as a different type of king. And yet we see him operating like any other king, seeing something he wants, and because he's king, he thinks he can take it. And so that's how the story begins. So, so David's going to have to respond. How are we going to make this? How are we going to make this sin go away? So I need someone who can read, say, from verse 6 to verse 13. So just a little bit further on in that. See what David's first response is.
I'll read it.
Okay, thanks, Jonah.
So David sent word to Joab, send me Uriah the Hittite. And Joab sent Uriah to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked how Joab and the people fared and how the war was going. And David said to Uriah, go down to your house and wash your feet. Uriah went out of the king's house, and there followed him a presence of the king. But Uriah slept at the entrance of the king's house with all the servants of his lord, and did not go down to his house. When they told David Uriah did not go down to his house, David said to Uriah, you have just come from a journey. Why did you not go down to your house? Uriah said to David, the ark and the Israel Judah remain in booths, and my lord Joab and the servants of the Lord are camping in an open field. Shall I then go to my house to eat and to drink and to lie with my wife? As you live and as your soul lives, I will never do such thing. Then David said to Uriah, remain here today also, and tomorrow I will send you back. So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day. On the next day, David invited him to eat and drink in his presence and made him drunk. And in the evening, he went out to lie on his couch with the servants of his Lord, but he did not go down to his house. Okay,
good. Thank you, Jonah. Let's just stop there because we'll come back. We'll continue that on in just a moment. We see the story again unfolding. Just before we go on, you think we're getting a story of high character or of low character here? I think we're beginning to see that David's actions are, again, not what we would want to think of as our king or kingly material, not what we would want to think of as someone who was great. And so this is a story that's beginning to describe this one who is actually the hero of ancient Israel. And they're telling the story of their hero, and it's not very it's not very candy coated. It's not very appetizing. It's one of his moments of great failure, but yet it gets told. So okay, someone who can take us from 14 on down to verse 25. So almost to the end of the chapter. In the morning,
Okay.
David. Okay, please.
In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. In the letter he wrote, set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him so that he may be struck down and die. As Joab was defining the city, he assigned Uriah to the place where he knew there were valiant warriors. the men of the city came out and fought with Joab, and some of the servants of David among the people fell. Uriah the Hittite was killed as well. Then Joab sent and told David all the news about the fighting. And he instructed the messenger, when you have finished telling the king all the news about the fighting, then if the king's anger rises, and if he says to you, why did you go so near the city to fight? Did you not know that they would shoot from the wall? Who killed Abimelech, son of Jerubbaal?
You're doing great. Keep going.
Did not a woman throw an upper milestone on him from the wall, so that he died at the BIB? Why did you go so near the wall? Then you shall say, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead too. So the messenger went and came and told David all that Joab had sent him to tell. The messenger said to David, the men gained an advantage over us and came out against us in the field, but we drove them back to the entrance of the gate. Then the archers shot at your servants from the wall. Some of the king's servants are dead, and your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. David said to the messenger, thus you shall say to Joab, do not let this matter trouble you, for the sword devours now one and now another. Press your attack on the city and overthrow it, and encourage him. When the wife of Uriah, do I keep going?
Yeah, go ahead. Do 2 more verses. That's fine.
Okay. When the wife of Uriah heard that her husband was dead, she made lamentation for him. When the mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son.
Okay. We're going to stop at that point. There's another chapter which actually takes it in kind of an interesting way. I'll walk it through kind of quickly. In chapter 12, David thinks now that all is well, because what's been the issue all along? The issue all along has been he was unfaithful, Bathsheba was unfaithful. There is a baby that needs a father, and so the hope is that Uriah would come back and unwittingly be able to be found as, be thought of as the father of the baby. When Uriah doesn't, and they have to actually set a trap, hatch a plan for him to be killed, and now he's dead, and his wife Bathsheba, she mourns him properly, but now she is a young mom who is about to give birth to a child with no husband, and so very fortunately, King David to the rescue, and he comes and does the noble thing of inviting this poor woman now into his house to provide for she and her baby. At least that is what the cover of the story is supposed to look like. Then the story goes on as David is there, and we'll talk more about these guys later, but there's a prophet who approaches David. His name is Nathan, and he tells David a story. The story goes about how a rich man who has flocks and flocks of sheep has a friend come by for a visit. Now there's also in the neighborhood a poor man who has only one sheep, and he lives his life for this one sheep, and he has nothing else in this world but this one sheep. He loves nothing in the world more than he loves this one sheep. But because the wealthy man is wealthy, he takes that one sheep, kills it in order to set a dinner feast for his friends who have come to visit. When David hears this story that Nathan is telling, David gets enraged and says, anyone here in our country who would do such a horrible thing should be put to death. And Nathan says, David, you are that man. You did exactly that by taking this one nobleman's wife and stealing her from him. And so you are the one who should receive this punishment that you as king have spoken but God will give you mercy. And God does show himself merciful throughout this second half, although the child will eventually die, that Bathsheba is giving birth to. And then at the close of the story, she becomes pregnant again. And this time she gives birth to a son by the name of Solomon, who will eventually become king himself. And then the end of the story is David goes out, and he, along with his army, who apparently all this whole time has been fighting against those people at Rabbah, they go out and they finally overthrow Rabbah, and David gets to come back with all the bounty. And so all seems well yet again. So going back to our questions, when we look about who's telling the story, that's, I think, a question that's pretty easy for all of us. Who's telling the story?
Narrator.
Narrator, very good, thank you. We don't know who the narrator is. We don't have his name, but clearly it is a narrator who is telling us how this story goes. How does the story begin and end? I kind of touched on the ending. That's a hard one for you to do because you didn't read chapter 12. But the story begins with the army going out to fight in the springtime against Rabbah, and then probably the next year, where the army now has finally won the victory over the people of Rabbah. So it's weird in that in this story that's nothing to do with how much of the story has to do with the war, almost none. But yet it starts off here at the beginning and it goes to a conclusion that is the conclusion of the story. This little snippet has to do with the war, but it's in the middle of the war that we see the character developed. Who are the main characters of the story? Go ahead and just name a few of them for me.
Uriah the Hittite, David, and Joab.
Okay, good. And Joab the general. Any other characters?
Bathsheba.
Mhm.
Did you say Nathan?
Bathsheba.
Bathsheba. Okay, yeah, Bathsheba. And again, in chapter 12, Nathan plays a role, and a few other minor characters, but nothing too dramatic. Okay, so those are our four main characters: David, Uriah, Bathsheba, and Joab. Which ones of those get the most development? This is an interesting kind of a question for us to work with. Who are the ones that the character, we get to understand a little bit of their motivations? That probably is the best way to put it. Whose motives do we get to see and understand a little bit for the narrator's eyes?
I would say
David and Uriah. Sorry, Jason.
no, go ahead. David and, well, I was going to say actually David and Joab, because Joab tells the messengers to say some things as well. That, you know.
No, good point. Who's the one of the big four characters? Who's the one who gets the least development? I should ask that.
I would say Bathsheba.
Yeah, clearly. What do we know about Bathsheba other than she's beautiful? Do we know any of her motives? Do we know any of her feelings? Do we know anything about her?
We just know that she got impregnated by David.
Yeah, that's about it. She was beautiful. She was bathing. She laid with the king and got pregnant. She eventually will, you know, lament or grieve her husband's passing. But that's really all we know. We don't even, you know, and again, going down to that number 6, you know, what are the names? What else was she referred to in the story? Or how else was she referred to?
I just remember like that she was the daughter of, is it Elaine, and then the wife of Uriah the Hittite. And I think that's just to represent her connections, like who she's, you know, who she belongs to, I guess you could say.
Yeah, you could say that. And that would probably not be far off from the truth. Yeah, that her identity is really wrapped up in the men of her life, isn't it? It's almost like she doesn't have agency in her own. And the narrator is being really careful to put that out there, because I think the reason for that is that it's easy for us sometimes to say, well, there's two bad actors in this. You got David, who should not have been, you know, a peeping Tom, and you've got Bathsheba, who shouldn't have been out, you know, tempting the king by bathing on her rooftop. Or, you know, the people who say, well, it takes two to tango, you know, that she shouldn't have gone to the king's chambers, or she should not have lied with him. But the narrator, just in the way that he tells the story, even though he's coming from an ancient perspective, he's already kind of almost speaking to our modern sensitivities here and saying, you know, she really didn't have agency of her own. And so let's not be looking to make her the scapegoat or her the one we blame. And I think by referring to her not as her own agency, but refers to her as like who she's connected with. She was Uriah's wife. She was Eliam's daughter. She becomes David's mistress, and then eventually becomes the mother of Solomon. And so always, even though we will see later in her story, we see that Bathsheba becomes a power broker of her own. She is quite a force to deal with. In this story, which talks about failure, it's not her failure that the narrator is inviting us to consider, but it's David's. And so that becomes one of those odd little clues that the story kind of gives us. And again, we see the other the other developed characters. Yeah, Joab does get some development, and Uriah does as well. Who is the most sympathetic character in the story? If you were to say, who was I liking the most, or who was I rooting for, or who would I wanted to root for? Who is the one that I said, this should be the hero of the story?
I think that's supposed to be Uriah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I mean, didn't you feel that, Jason? You know, here we have, if you're going to do a character study between he and David, you know, David seems to be a man of a very flawed character, but yet at every point, Uriah seems to be one who is holding up his end. I mean, you know, he comes back, he gives an honest report of what's going on in the war. He doesn't go and sleep with his wife because, you know, his buddies, the others who are also fighting the war, they're not getting to sleep with their wives. So why should he have that privilege? You know, he is showing a loyalty to his fellow soldiers and an integrity to his king, his God, his country. And so when you talk about integrity, you see that it's Uriah at every point who is being lifted up as the good character. And David, again, oddly enough, because he's the famous one, Uriah is only in this one chapter of all the Bible. David is a key player in the Old Testament. And yet, if we're looking at this and saying there's a contrast, the pole is between David and Uriah gets all the greatness. So if you were doing an example of what greatness would mean in this story, you could take everything that Uriah exhibits and say that is what the Bible is saying is great characteristics, and everything that we see David doing, whether it be you know, taking advantage of a young woman, whether it be seeing something that is not his and just choosing to take it for his own, whether it be using his position or his privilege to not only to have his way with her, but also to have her husband executed unjustly. You know, we see all these characters that we say that is exactly who you wouldn't want to be. And we see that Uriah plays the exact opposite. He's the polar extreme. And so, again, this is part of what the narrator is trying to do, is not only tell us a story that all of us are flawed and that David, as great as he was also a flawed character, but the narrator is also trying to, in a sense, define what does it mean to be a person of good character. And in this particular story, surprisingly enough, he uses Uriah as the example of good character. And he kind of surprises us by flipping it around and saying David is the example that you don't want to follow. And so so those are some of the, again, just some of the cues. Again, interesting story, a good example of how narrative is used to do more than just tell a story, but to help inform you know, future generations about what does it mean to be a person of good character. And so Uriah becomes the hero in this little snippet, even though in the second level of narrative, David is far larger character as it comes to understanding his role with the covenant people. So I won't go any further with that, but I think this story makes for maybe my favorite. I mean, there's a lot of great stories in the Old Testament, but this one, again, just for all of it becomes a real good example of what does it mean for us to have character, and what does it mean to have flawed character, and how do we as a people kind of identify that which we think is great or character, and how do we contrast it with flaw or lack of greatness in the world around us. So again, that's part of the context. So when you do 3.1 this week and talk to your 10 people about what is greatness, keep this one in mind. Again, if you were talking to the narrator of this story, he'd probably say, you know, I knew a guy, his name was Uriah. You've never heard of him. He wasn't very significant, but he was a great character. And he would tell you why, because he was a man of great integrity. He loved his country. He honored his wife. He respected his God. He did things right. Now he paid a price for it, but he did things that were right. And so it becomes kind of an interesting piece as that assignment for us as we ask about who we think others feel is great. Okay, and the rest of the week is going to kind of follow along this idea of looking at narrative and understanding the flow of this second level narrative. How is it fitting in the midst of the Old Testament story? So I would just encourage you just to enjoy there's a couple of videos I think are really good, and just enjoy those. Don't worry too much about the videos. We don't have any videos this week like we did last week with the Christine Hayes, where you've got to answer questions directly and try to get the answers right. These are mostly just videos that give you kind of a little bit of view of how narrative or different aspects of Old Testament narrative fit in the context of the Bible. And perhaps, we probably won't get into it much, but this idea of what does greatness look like does move into the story of Jesus as well. In fact, Jesus will ask that same question, or it'll be asked of him at a couple of points, and he does some really interesting things with the idea of greatness. Probably the best example of that, I'll just throw it up on the screen here. The best example of greatness was here in chapter 18 of the Gospel of Matthew, when someone asked him who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Jesus had a real interesting response. He said, he called a child to him, he placed his hands on them, and he said, I tell you, unless you change and become like this little child, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. So there are different parts. It's a different part of the narrative. This is a New Testament aspect, but again, it goes to this idea of what does it mean to have character? What does it mean to be great? And Jesus says one of the defining moments or defining markers of greatness is going to be with this idea of taking a lowly position, or again, going back to that word from Deuteronomy, that taking a place or a position of humility. And in that humble place is going to be the marker of greatness. Now, so when you do your assignment and talk to your 10 folks, see if anyone says, when you say, why is that person great? See if anyone says, oh, it's because they're so humble. They probably won't say that. They'll probably say something like, well, because they changed the world with their discoveries. He invented the Tesla automobile, and so therefore he is great. Or he scored more baskets than anyone in the NBA history, so therefore he must be great. Or maybe they've done things that, altered the course of history, or took on positions of authority. Humility probably won't be the answer, although you might find some that people represent or people lift up, and they'll say things that kind of catch that same theme. This person is great because they sacrificed everything to help me get ahead. or this person is great because they loved and gave themselves away. And then you'll begin to see that in some answers of greatness, even in our society, we begin to reflect some of that which Jesus was talking about, that idea of taking the low position so that others might be able to achieve their fullness, becomes a marker of what Jesus says greatness is. Okay? All right, well, tackle week 3. It's going to be an awesome week. There's some really good reading, and there's some really, really good stuff. There's a couple of really cool videos. I'm just going to give you a little bit of a little warning that they're really pretty good. But for the most part, it is a fun week. But again, using a little bit of the ideas of what Jesus said, a little bit of how the Bible describes David and others. That could be a good grid for us as we look at greatness in our world. Do we have any questions?
Not right now.
Okay. Feel free to hit me up if you do have any questions. If you have any questions that need an answer right away, shoot me an email, and I will be watching for it, and I'll be getting back to you on that. Okay. But there's some really good stuff this week, and it shouldn't be. My hope is that it's not really too heavy, except the readings are, a chapter here and a chapter there, and some of those they're good examples. I think I really like the Fee and Stewart this week, and but that's just me. I'm a Fee and Stewart guy. So okay, well, if that's the case, if there's no questions, then I'm going to say you guys get after it. Okay, have a great week, and if there's anything else that I can do for you, be praying for you, let me know. Okay, be praying for Jonathan and you, Jessica. And anything else that's going on, you guys let me know.
Thank you so much, John.
Yeah.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome.
Good night.
Bye.
Okay. Good night, you guys.